This video is brought to you by SKILLSHARE. If you want 2 free months of access to their creative writing courses and much more, click the link in the description below.
That is a fun thing for me, the idea that we have gods, we search for meaning, and we think of that as the highest thought we can have. Who made me, and I'm gonna make other things.
What is my purpose?
You passed butter.
Oh my god.
Yeah, welcome to the club, pal.
Like Campbell calls God an impersonal cosmic force. That's the most terrifying thing about it. It doesn't give a fuck about you. Rick is the seam between God and man.
Alright, so there's a lot to dive into what Dan Harmon said there, but I'm really interested in 2 specific sections of the quote. First, Joseph Campbell, the name Dan Harmon dropped when talking about God, and second, Rick and his characterization within the story. So let's start this off by talking about Joseph Campbell and why he matters. Well, simply put, Joseph Campbell was an American professor who theorized about comparative mythology and comparative religion. Okay, crap, that wasn't simple at all, let's try this again. Joseph Campbell was a very smart guy who cared very much about storytelling, and the reason he matters is because Dan Harmon's entire way of thinking about how stories are constructed is influenced by Joseph Campbell. Without getting too into the weeds, Dan Harmon believes that stories generally fit into a circle that follows set points, regardless of the story's origin in time, religion, or culture. Dan got his mindset from Joseph Campbell, who first proposed the idea of the monomyth, more commonly known as the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell argued that the monomyth is the common premise for vast variations of stories, and that it involves a hero who goes on an adventure, wins a decisive victory during a crisis, and then comes home changed or transformed. And for maximum clarity, the hero does not need to be someone who wears a cape, or is even brave. The hero can be understood as the protagonist. The adventure they go on can be mundane or extraordinary, or anything in between. The victory could be moral, physical, or mental. The transformation could be minute or grand. Basically, the monomyth isn't concerned with the specifics of how its formula is followed. It only exists to represent that it is in fact being followed. The argument is that even though stories themselves can be different, they are all connected by the monomyth that does not change. For Dan Harmon and Joseph Campbell, the monomyth is the blank canvas from which narratives are born. It permeates and appears differently from story to story, from existence to existence, but ultimately, it anchors storytelling to a consistent premise that connects them all. And understanding Dan Harmon's perspective on storytelling is crucial in going forward, since he is the co-creator of the show that this video is about. And by having such an understanding, we can introduce Rick and Morty into the mix. I would argue that instead of looking at the monomyth as a core premise for limitless stories, Rick and Morty takes that opportunity to explore the monomyth in relation to characters. The show itself is an animated representation of the idea that single characters can be just as malleable as stories, that there exists a central core in characters that can experience change across a limitless amount of settings, but still have that character's monomyth unchanged at their core.
It's the genius police.
Okay, yeah, that was a lot, but I think things will be much better explained using an aid we are all familiar with: comics. They actually use monomyths extremely well, especially Spider-Man. The series does a great job of illustrating the conceptual difference between character monomyths and premise monomyths. For instance, the Amazing Spider-Man, the Spectacular Spider-Man, and the Sensational Spider-Man all center around Peter Parker as the main character. Certain aspects of his character are consistent across all of the series, and those aspects create his monomyth. But in each of the different series, his monomyth is expressed differently. In each of the series, Peter fights different villains, dates different women, and faces different struggles. But at the end of the day, in each of those narratives, he is definitely still Peter Parker. That is his character monomyth. On the flip side, Spider-Gwen, Miles Morales, and Penny Parker are different expressions of a premise monomyth. The premise being an individual using abilities derived from a spider to fight crime. That premise is consistent across each of the different series, even though the characters interacting with that premise are different. That is the basis of a premise monomyth. Now, applying that distinction to Rick and Morty, Season 3 Episode 7 Tales from the Citadel gives us thousands of Mortys and thousands of Ricks, all technically the same character, just having lived countless lives across countless different circumstances. Just like how the Monomyth is unchanging at its core, but can be expressed as limitless amounts of stories, the same can be said for the Ricks and Mortys of the Citadel. They are all Ricks and they are all Mortys. That's not changing. That is their Monomyth. But what does change is the expression of their monomyths due to the different lives that each one of them has lived. And the Ricks and Mortys of the episode did not change to become so different from each other on their own. That happened because of the premise monomyth that they all interact with, the Citadel. The Ricks and Mortys are variable, but the Citadel is constant across all of them. It is the one consistent premise that shapes and forms the monomyths of all these characters in different ways. And because of how excellent the writing of the show is, it can be hard to see the connectivity that binds each Rick and Morty to their counterparts. Cop Morty couldn't be further from Morty C-137, and both of them couldn't be further from Lizard Morty. The same thing goes for Meth Rick, Black Rick, and Simple Rick. But at the same time, the writing also justifies a true connection between the characters. Their monomyths persist and connect them through all of their unique expressions. For example, each of the different Mortys at the school have a picture of their crushes in their lockers. All of the Ricks on the Citadel are still alcoholics. These characteristics act as evidence that the same traits transcend branching situational timelines that made these Mortys and Ricks so different. They act like the plots on the Monomyth Circle, the ever-present markers of their characters. But interestingly, the rest of the show is actually told in a monomythic inverse of Tales from the Citadel. Where that episode gives us a single consistent premise, the Citadel, with multiple monomyth expressions, all the Ricks and Mortys, the rest of the show gives us multiple premises with only two expressions, Morty C-137 and Rick C-137. We can reference back to what Dan Harmon said about Rick to dive into this point. The central aspect of Rick C-137 is that he is the seam between God and man. Rick's character monomyth is that of a regular mortal who has self-attained godhood. Rick is essentially all-knowing, all-present, and all-powerful. He is above all other beings and entities by virtue of his own intellect. In a multiverse without a concrete deity, Rick kicked down the door to be the closest thing to fill that position. His godhood is reiterated as a central theme throughout the show as well.
He shouldn't be your hero. He's more like a demon or a super f***ed up god.
Jesus, he's not a f***ing god.
You don't know what I am. You don't know what I can do. You think if God existed, he could do it? The answer is no. If God exists, it's fucking me.
On the other hand, Morty's character monomyth seems to be that of a regular everyday human who is thrust into overwhelming and over-the-top situations. In a way, Morty would be the straight man if the show were a pure comedy. His reactions to the circumstances are completely opposite of Rick's because he represents a normal person doing godlike adventures with a godlike being. Part of Morty's character is to be completely powerless next to Rick, emphasizing how drastically he needs to act and change just to keep pace with things Rick finds mundane. And that is where the beauty of the show's general premise is able to shine. We are able to see the reactions of basically an intellectual demigod and the most normal human being there is in literally limitless different circumstances. Other shows have to be very particular with both their characters and the premise they set their story upon, because traditionally, you only get one premise. Characters can only be as interesting as the premise they are set in and the adventures that they go on, because the premise evokes their traits. The story of Breaking Bad would have been a lot less engaging if Walter White went out into the middle of the desert to cook beef Wellington. Batman wouldn't work if the premise of his story was set in Sesame Street and his main antagonist was Snuffleupagus. Okay, crap, that actually sounds really cool, but you get my point. The places and people your characters interact with are the catalyst for entertainment. And while other shows are traditionally limited to one premise, Rick and Morty straight up spits on that idea. Do you want to see the characters get in a knick-knack fight with Satan? Do you want to see them immigrate to a planet made of corn? Do you want to hear them singing about defecating on the floor so Earth doesn't get destroyed by giant space heads? Done, done, and done. Rick and Morty's allure is that it has created a premise that, in and of itself, allows it infinite premises. There is nothing too stupid or too smart for the show to handle. And because of this, we are able to see Rick's consistent monomyth and Morty's consistent monomyth interact with situations other shows wouldn't dare to touch. And that's why both Rick and Morty feel so genuine to the audience. The truest way to know a fictional character is to see them react to different situations. Robert McKee, who literally wrote the book on story, has written, "True character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation, the truer the choice to the character's essential nature." Therefore, if we learn about characters through their interaction with struggle, the introduction of new forms of struggle will show us new sides of a character. Well, no show can introduce struggle like Rick and Morty because the show gives itself infinite opportunity for conflict. The fun of the show is seeing these monomyths, the God Man and the mundane boy, interact with an unpredictable premise of struggle each episode. But also interestingly, Tales from the Citadel introduces us to a deviation in the story structure. While the majority of the show takes the singular monomyths of Rick and Morty and puts them in various premises, and Tales from the Citadel depicts a singular premise with various expressed monomyths, we also get Evil Morty, a character that pretty much rejects the premise of the entire show. We understand him to be a Morty, and therefore have Morty's character monomyth, but we are left completely in the dark about which premise he interacted with to make him what he is. And if that last part sounds familiar, it's because that mystery mirrors another character, Rick. Rick is kept enigmatic because just like Dan Harmon said, he is the seam between God and man, and to Dan, God is an impersonal cosmic force, keyword being impersonal. If we knew everything about Rick, that would defeat the purpose of what Dan envisions as a godlike character. So by understanding that, we get a sense of Evil Morty's allure as well. He is just as impersonal as Rick, but the writers chose to make him even more dangerous. Rick's near godhood is established by him basically being smart enough to conquer almost any situation he comes across. Whether it is a person, the environment, or technology, Rick always finds a way to surmount it, as a god would. But where Rick's deification comes from dominating a universe of, by comparison, mere mortals, Evil Morty conquered an entire society of Ricks. If Rick is the self-made deity that surmounted a hypothetical god, Evil Morty is the mundane boy that surmounted the self-made deity. He is to Rick what Rick is to God. Listen to writer for the show Ryan Ridley talk about it himself.
And this is a Morty who was not just one step ahead of our Rick, but one step ahead of all Ricks.
The division I see is between the Ricks and Mortys that like the Citadel divided and the rest of us.
You know, everything he's saying is the right thing. It's just that he only said it in order to manipulate an entire space station of genius scientists to give him the ultimate power in the multiverse, which is pretty terrifying to think about what that portends.
All this complexity, this nuance, is possible because of the masterful way that the Rick and Morty team has set up the characters and premise of the show. Of course, you might not be able to do the same thing with your writing unless you plan on having a multiverse, but take note in how to create a premise that evokes the most from your characters. Even without multiple timelines and universes, Rick and Morty does a great job of fleshing out the characters with carefully chosen, provocative circumstances. Tales from the Citadel gives us a look at Morty's and Rick's pull to their wildest degrees. It shows us a Morty with the power of a god. It's an episode that perfectly recognized the premise that had been established and then warped it into something we couldn't pull our eyes away from. If there's one thing I hope you might take away from this video, it is to look at your own writing and closely examine where you can take your characters and the premises they interact with. Because as the monomyth dictates, the possibilities are limitless. Hey guys, thank you all for watching. If you felt like you learned anything at all from this video, I would highly recommend checking out SKILLSHARE to learn even more. No matter where you are in your journey of being a writer, they have something for you. One of the lessons that I wish I had seen when I was writing my first book was 6 steps to creating successful writing habits. Writing is definitely more of a marathon than a sprint, and cultivating the right mindset to continue for months instead of just hours is a crucial skill to have. And if you're looking for courses that really dive into the meat and potatoes of writing, you're in luck, because SKILLSHARE has content on narrative conflict, character creation, and even poetry. The best part is SKILLSHARE is giving away a free 2-month unlimited access trial to my subscribers who click the link in the description. And even after that, it'll still be pretty cheap at about $10 a month. If you are someone who wants to improve in their craft, join 7 million other creative minds with SKILLSHARE. As always, I had a blast making this video, and I will talk to you all again soon.